Hey everyone, the end is nigh. Season 6, episode 11, Breaking Bad. We finally get to see Walt and Jesse make their cameos, and boy, do we see Gene break bad in this episode. Hi, I'm Courtney. You're watching Courtney's Reviews. If you are a first-time viewer, please consider subscribing. If you like what I'm doing here, give me a thumbs up. If you like this video, it's the only way that the YouTube algorithm recognizes me. And as always, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's get right into it. So the episode begins inside of the crystal ship, the RV, and we see Saul's point of view through a bag, and then we get to see some close-ups on some flasks and beakers and like the red phosphorus, which of course is a component of the meth making process, but also what Walt uses in the desert when Crazy Eight and Emilio show up. And the only dialogue we hear is from Saul, and he's saying, mucho dinero, mucho dinero, which is a fun little callback to the early days of Better Call Saul.
Whatever the problemo, we can fix it with dinero. Mucho dinero. Mucho dinero.
No, señor, no
Make with the dinero.
Dinero.
Dinero. See, righteous dinero.
Dinero.
And that scene from Uno, the very first episode of Better Call Saul, of course, is when Jimmy meets Salamanca for the first time. He meets Tuco. So this is a sort of interesting full circle moment, right? So, of course, the line in Breaking Bad in the desert in season 2, episode 8, Better Call Saul, when we first meet Saul Goodman. This is from Saul's point of view in this episode titled Breaking Bad. And that line, though, from Breaking Bad, it wasn't me, it was Ignacio. Lalo didn't send you. No, Lalo, of course, was the genesis of the Lalo character and Nacho Ignacio Varga. So, and this fear that Jimmy Saul still harbors about Lalo coming back from the dead, is still very real. So it's going back to the very first episode where he meets Salamanca for the first time, and then the fear here is an interesting little full circle moment. And I think it's worth noting that the episode begins with him tied up. He's got his wrists and his ankles taped together. He's got a bag over his head, and at that moment, he thinks he's going to maybe die. So but of course he ends up getting out of it. So it's just something I think that we should keep in mind as we move forward with not just the breakdown, but the last 2 episodes of the series. So this moment of him being tied up, he feels like he's been caught, and it looks like death is perhaps imminent. So in my breakdown of the last episode, Nippy, I talked a lot about the degradation of the video in the title sequence. So go and check that out if you wanted to hear my thoughts about the title sequence and what they might do with these final 3 episodes. And as predicted, we got something we've never seen before. So in the past, we've seen clips of, the swing pro, of the justice scales with the cigarette ash, of the Cadillac, of the tarantula, of the coffee mug, but we haven't seen this yet. And so the 2 images that come through are Gene's rocking chair with his rusty nail, and it looks like as though he just got up from the chair because it is rocking. So we get this idea of Gene standing up. And the last image that comes through as the recording is the aerial shot of the Crossroads that we saw both in the teaser and we see in this episode. So taken together, those 2 images from the outset lets you know what this episode is going to be about. Gene gets up and he comes to a crossroads. So those of you who have been watching me for a while might remember from my breakdown of Axe and Grind, I noted the swirl down the drain in Jimmy and Kim's apartment, and I remarked that it's never a good thing to see something swirling down the drain. Then, of course, in Plan and Execution, you see that things really go down the drain quickly. And yeah. So right after the title sequence in this episode, we open up on yet another sink, but this one is clogged. And Francesca is in the apartment. I'm assuming she's the landlord, maybe like a building manager. And she's plunging the sink. And then she stops as she sees what's bubbling up, right? So the seeds and stems that these two kids put down the sink. So watching this scene, we see that these two guys have tried to wash the evidence down the drain, but it comes bubbling back up, right? It's floating. So this could perhaps be a metaphor for what happens in the conversation that follows between Francesca and Jean when she says that, the feds found everything. They found all the shell companies. They found the money that he had with Tigerfish down in Antigua and Barbuda. Or it could perhaps be foreshadowing for something else, right? So more evidence might come to the surface. So we'll just have to wait and see on that one. But it does visually let us know that you can't wash the evidence away. It can come floating back up. So then Francesca has some back and forth with these guys, and she tells them that they can't do this. And they're on the defensive. We didn't do it, Narca. They call her Narca. And she ends up walking out. She looks at the clock. She sees it's 2:05. And as soon as I saw the clock, I was like, oh my gosh, the phone call's coming up. So she says she's got to go and to just leave the plunger outside. And I think this is one of several instances in this episode that might be foreshadowing for how people might be done cleaning up after Saul, for how they might spill. They call her Narca, and a narc, of course, is someone who spills, who rats. But she does go to the phone booth out in the desert, and this phone booth, I was chatting with Pete Peppers right after the episode aired. And we were talking about, does this gas station look familiar to you? And we both thought it did. And we both had the same idea that it was the gas station that we see in Breaking Bad when Jesse goes to, when he's out on his own, he's takes the RV out on his own, and he goes to fill up gas, and he has no cash. So he exchanges gas for a little bag of meth. And it's the same site. So I went back to the episode in Breaking Bad where that happens to compare the shots, and the billboard from Big Chief, or the sign from Big Chief, is the same sign that we see here, RS. You see the little hole in the side of the sign. I was also able to match the mountains a little bit. And also the front of the building, you have the windows and the door are in the same spot. So it looks very much like the same location. It's just they changed businesses, and obviously this station is now out of business. But it is an interesting thing to remark, not just because it's perhaps a location that they've used to shoot before, but because of what the site represents. It is a site of exchange. So Jesse trades meth for gas, and here Jean is trading information for money. So when they speak, Jean asks, tell me how hot. And she tells him about how they found all the shell companies. And he says, well, what about, if there was money down in like the islands? And she knows immediately what he's talking about. And she's like, Tigerfish Corporation. And then she tells him that she gave that to the Fed. So remember, I just said a couple of seconds ago that it might be foreshadowing that she might actually narc. Well, it turns out that she did give information to the feds, although she didn't really have a choice. As she explains, they keep put her name on a fictional company. What was she supposed to do? It seems like a good time to mention some film references that I've noticed watching this episode. So I obviously have been talking about the nods to Frankenstein, the references to both the 1931 film and the actual story itself. But something else occurred to me as I was watching this episode. I mean, there's quite a few references to Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas. Perhaps as Francesca is driving and she's, looking around, like over her shoulder, she's looking to see if she's being followed. That's something that we've seen in a lot of different shows and films. But in terms of Goodfellas, of course, we see towards the end of the film, right before he gets busted, Henry Hill is driving and there's like the helicopter following him. But also there's a scene when the feds come into the house and Henry's wife, Karen, flushes all of their dope down the toilet. And when he gets out of jail later and they're arguing about it, she's like, what was I supposed to do? What was I supposed to do? So not exactly what happens here with Francesca, but she had to give up the information. And of course, Saul is not her husband. There's no love lost there, right? So, but it's just one of several other references. And another one is coming up very shortly, and I'll talk about that. So she wasn't going to risk herself to save him. But yet here she is taking a pretty big risk. She is still being followed somewhat by the feds when she shows up at this phone booth. So it's not without risk that she is taking this phone call, but she's not doing it out of, out of any love for Saul Goodman, right? So she makes it clear that she's not going to speak to him until she's given what she was promised. So then he gives her instructions to pull a fishing line, and it will be connected to an old water pipe. So we begin this episode after the title sequence with a clogged sink full of water, and here we start to get a couple of other water and fish references. So fishing line, water pipe, Tigerfish Corporation, and of course the USS Tigerfish is the name of the submarine in the film Ice Station Zebra. And also in this conversation, we get a lot of questions answered that I don't know if you guys had following Breaking Bad, but I did, right? So what happens to Huel? What happens to Skylar? That was really nice to hear what happens with those two characters. Phoebe is one we don't know anything about, so I don't know if there's opportunity for him to pop up in the final 2 episodes, perhaps. We'll just have to wait and see there. But of course, the most important part of this conversation is the mention of one Kim Wexler. And Francesca lets him know that one person did call her to check up on her, and that was Kim. And that tracks with what we know about Kim. I mean, Kim and Francesca were always very friendly. Francesca helped Kim a lot when they were in practice together after she broke her arm. And it's clear that, Francesca really admires Kim and looks up to Kim. And it speaks to Kim's character that she would call to check in on Francesca. And clearly Kim has not been in touch with Saul since, he left town because she didn't even know that he was alive. You can see the surprise on his face when he hears that she asked about him. She asked after him. And maybe that's just a little bit of a glimmer of hope that someone out there still does care about him, because clearly Francesca doesn't. As soon as the phone call is over, she doesn't wait around to exchange niceties. She hangs up right away. Then after Gene leaves the phone booth, we see him come to a crossroads. And at that crossroads, he decides to turn around and go back to call Kim. And Crossroads, I think most of us are familiar with what that might mean symbolically, like a character is faced with a decision, right? There are multiple directions that they may go. And I just wanted to pause here to talk a little bit about the historical significance of crossroads, right? So in folklore, they represent a liminal space. So it's a place that's neither here nor there, a place that is both betwixt and between. It's also heavily associated with the supernatural or paranormal. So in different cultures, the crossroads have meant different things. So dating back to Greek mythology, medieval folklore. So in Great Britain and Ireland, there was a tradition of burying criminals and suicide victims at a crossroads. And this was perhaps because the crossroad marked the boundaries of the settlement, coupled with a desire to bury those outside of the law, outside of the settlement itself. And in African American folklore, and this probably comes from West Africa, specifically the Yoruba, and their trickster deity called Eshu Eligba. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, who resided at a crossroads. And in Hoodoo, there's a practice where it's believed that you can sell your soul to the devil at a crossroads in exchange for some gift or talent, like playing a musical instrument, dancing, etc. So it is believed that one may attend upon a crossroads a certain number of times, either at midnight or just before dawn, and one will meet the devil who will bestow upon you your desired skills. And this practice is believed to have originated from a blues musician by the name of Robert Johnson. So there's a lot, I'm looking at the Wikipedia page on Crossroads, but there's a lot of different takes on the significance of the crossroads. But for Gene arriving at this crossroads, he decides to turn around and go back and call Kim. And I don't take this to mean like a literal meaning of like this is where he meets the devil at the crossroads, but I think it's worth noting, right? Especially since in the scene immediately following the conversation with Kim, we see that little on switch flip on the dough mixer at Cinnabon. A quick shout out to Joe Mama, who on my Frankenstein video pointed out the connection between the on switch and Frankenstein. So Gene goes back to the phone booth and he calls Kim. And this scene reminds me of a few things, right? So it reminds me a little bit of a past scene with at HHM. When Jimmy first tells Chuck, the news that he's a lawyer, he passed the bar, and he goes and asks if he could work at HHM, and Chuck's like, oh, I'll have to confer with the other partners. Then we get that scene where they're in the mailroom. Jimmy, Kim, and the other mailroom employees are celebrating in the mailroom when Howard walks in. And then everyone leaves and the door shuts, and we don't actually get to hear the dialogue, but the dialogue isn't really important in that scene. We see how crestfallen Jimmy is. Something similar happens in this episode. So Gene calls Kim, and we don't actually get to hear the conversation. And I should probably say calls Kim's place of business, because it's not confirmed that he's actually speaking to her. I know there's isolated audio out there where it certainly seems like he is speaking to Kim, but we'll have to wait and see in the next episode, perhaps. But anyway, those two scenes reminded me of each other, right? So like we are on the outside, we don't actually get to hear the dialogue that is being spoken, but again, the focus, the emphasis is on Gene's reaction here. And the other thing that this reminded me of is yet another scene from Goodfellas when Jimmy, played by Robert De Niro, makes a call at a phone booth. His friend Joe Pesci, who plays the character of Tommy, was supposed to be made that day, and Jimmy gets the news that Tommy was whacked. And this is his reaction. And so it reminded me a lot of the reaction we see here from Gene. So homage, right? We shouldn't take it to mean that it is exactly the same kind of bad news that Gene receives here. So as I already noted, immediately after this scene is when we see Gene back at Cinnabon, the little on switch flips on, and then we see the dough mixer going around in circles, and there's a prominent exit sign in this shot. So Gene is all mixed up. And in my last breakdown, I said he wasn't really quite throwing caution to the wind. But here he definitely is. And I think this plan is, as I've already noted, his inflamed sense of rejection and hurt and rage. And it's I think what we're seeing here with Jean is someone that is just really hell-bent on this path of self-destruction. It's not that he necessarily needs the money. It's just that it's like he's lost all hope. And then there's another Goodfellas nod, I think, in the next scene at Marion's house when Jeff walks in and he finds Jean sitting there with his mom and she's showing him her computer. And then Jeff very quickly notes that, oh, it wasn't that expensive, no big expenses, sort of thing. And there's a scene in Goodfellas when they're out at a restaurant. It's around Christmas time, and it's right after a big heist. And Jimmy, Bob De Niro, had instructed everyone to like lay low, no big purchases, things like that. But then one comes in a brand new Cadillac. A bunch of them are wearing fur coats, and he, blows a gasket. So this reminded me a little bit of that as well. And so then Jeff and Jean go into the garage where Jean asks if he works the night shift, and Jeff says, "Do you mean the graveyard shift?" So quite a few nods to death. Certainly the dugout graveyard. I really hope they don't kill this character off, but there's a lot of potential foreshadowing in this episode that is the way it's headed. Of course, it could just be symbolic death, like this will come to an end, and that's what I'm ultimately hoping for, but we'll just have to wait and see. And then we see Jeff and Jean and Buddy put their plan into action. So somewhat of the old scams that he would play in the bar with Marco, but this is something far different. We get this scene where it opens up on him doing karaoke, singing the song Brandy, and listening to those lyrics closely, it could perhaps be read as maybe how he's feeling about Kim. So, Brandy, you're a fine girl, you'd be a fine wife, but his only love is the sea. So again, yet another water reference here. And I've always thought of Swimmy McGill the fish as symbolic for Jimmy. He's sitting down at the bar with this guy who he lost the bet to. That's why he had to sing this song. And the guy calls him Viktor. So Viktor Frankenstein, this is something I go over in detail in my Ring and Jean video. But of course, Viktor is an old alias that he has used previously. And he lets this guy win all of the bets. And then we see how it works. So Jeff picks him up. He takes him to his house, puts tape on the door, and then Buddy is able to go in later and take photos of credit cards, his ID, other financial documents, and this is how they are scamming these marks. And then this money is sold to someone for cash. When I first saw the episode and I wrote down some of my thoughts, I mentioned that at first I wasn't really terribly impressed with the Breaking Bad scene, but certainly by this point of the episode, I began to understand why they made these decisions. And it's the beginning of, well, it's not the beginning of his decline, because I would actually say, like, in the very first episode, when he first encounters Tuco Salamanca, is the beginning of the decline. But certainly once, Walt and Jesse take him out into the desert. They have him on his knees in front of a dug out grave. And then when he gets back on the RV, doesn't really seem all that flustered by it. Instead, he's just seeing opportunity. He's seeing dollar signs. He's seeing a lucrative future. And that to me, the scene is really harrowing, right? Like, it really highlights the monstrosity of everything that goes on in Breaking Bad and in this relationship. So a bunch of you in the comments on my Frankenstein video mentioned that perhaps another way to read it is that Saul is responsible for the creation of Walter White. And as I noted in that video, that was just one way to read the story. And I wasn't saying like Jimmy is all Frankenstein monster or all Viktor Frankenstein. I see elements of both in him. And the same could be said for Walt, right? So he is in part Jimmy's or Saul's creation, right? Because Saul enables him, but he's also the mad scientist. He likely would have become Heisenberg even without Saul's influence. Like he was already on that path. But as I noted in that video, right, like these characters all influence each other. So you can't say like this one created that one. It's not like the story of Victor Frankenstein creating the creature necessarily, but it certainly gives context to how Saul was in part responsible for creating the monster of Heisenberg. There are a lot of Easter eggs in this scene too. I'm sure other channels have covered it already, but the fact that the RV has a hard time starting, of course, is something we've seen before. The fact that Jesse refers to it as the crystal ship, we also hear that line at really later towards the end of Breaking Bad when Walt brings Jesse's $5 million cash to him. And the way the little red light on the dash goes off when Walt takes the keys out. And there's a nice little moment where Jesse asks who Lalo is. And you can see the horror on the trauma still on Saul's face. And I think it's interesting to note the way that these two scenes are edited together. So when the door shuts on that first Mark's house, it cuts to the RV door opening. So you can trace a line from like this decision to go into business, to enter business with Walt and Jesse leads to this decision here in the Jane timeline. And then in the Tapioca Tundra montage, we see him like adopt all of his old Saul characteristics. He gets the swing pro, he's sleeping with sex workers, and we also get to see all of the different men that they end up conning. But then at the end of that montage, we are back in Cinnabon and Gene switches off. So remember, he flipped it on after the phone call with Kim before he went full like Franken-Gene on the situation, and now he turns it off before one of the most critical scenes of the episode. And that's when he meets with the Mark who has cancer. And unlike the other Marks that we saw, certainly the first one, and then all the other ones in between, this guy seems like a pretty decent guy. And he buys a round of drinks. He even offers to give Gene the cab at the end. And for a second there, I thought that Gene might actually get into the cab to spare this guy. And there are a couple of things I wanted to talk about in this conversation that he has with this gentleman. So they're talking about the corruption of like financial advisors, like Bernie Madoff and stuff like that. And the guy says there are a few bad apples, but most of them are straight shooters. And I find that troubling. Because that could perhaps be foreshadowing that he himself is an actual straight shooter. And when Gene breaks into his house later, maybe he has a weapon. Another thing that he says reminds me and I mentioned this on the P. Peppers live stream, reminded me very much of that moment in Breaking Bad when Walt meets Jane's dad, Donald Margolis, at the bar. And it was something that Don said to Walt that ultimately made him go back to Jesse's apartment where Jane dies. And this guy in this scene with Gene says, you only go around once, when Gene asks him, should you be drinking that? And I think that there is a moment of sincere concern for him. There is a little bit of humanity in what Gene is saying. And the guy saying you only go around once resonates with Gene. He's like, yeah, that's true. You only live once. And I think that line was the motivation that makes him go forward with the plan. And he's sitting at home in his chair and he's watching this wildlife documentary. And the last line of that wildlife documentary before he switches channels is something to the effect of like, unless the animals are disease free, they'll be left behind. So this man is He's a cancer patient, but also you can think of Gene himself as being diseased. This compulsion to slip is like he's like an addict. He's like an addict, and he has fallen off the wagon here and relapsed, and he's going full force ahead. And so when he receives the phone call that Buddy chickened out, he didn't want to go through with the plan because the guy has cancer. Gene is enraged by this, and he's like, garage now. And it's a very sort of Heisenbergian move, and it has certainly echoes of how Heisenberg treats Jesse at certain points when Buddy's trying to reason with him in the garage that, hey, we're doing well, let's just let this one slide. And he's like, no, it happens today. So I mentioned this in my breakdown of Nippy, that I think there's more to Marion than meets the eye. I think she's much sharper than Gene gives her credit for. And so when they go to the garage at Marion's house, we see her lying in bed watching her little cat videos on YouTube. And there are two things I wanted to note about this scene. The bird paintings above her bed reminded me again of Kim. So in my Nippy breakdown, I mentioned how much some of her personality reminds me of Kim. And again, this might just be like the Midwestern or like Nebraskan kind of similarities between them. But then when she looks out the window and she's watching what's happening, it's strange, right? It's in the middle of the night, and why are they rushing into the garage? And Gene has his voice elevated, and he yells at Buddy to shut the dog up. And this is someone that allegedly, loves dogs. That's how he met Marion, looking for his lost beloved Pomeranian, Nippy. So Buddy says he's out, and Gene fires him. And again, that kind of reminds me of the scene with Jesse and Walt, where Walt is like, "You're fired," So again, that sort of knee-jerk, impulsive reaction. And Jeff and Gene pull up to this guy's house, and we are told that it's been some time since he was given the water with the barbiturates in it. It could have worn off. So I am very, very worried for Gene at this point, and cannot wait to see what they do with the next two episodes. So that being said, I know I didn't mention the mic scene here, and also the way that's interspliced, I think, is also really telling about how he was warned. Saul was warned not to get involved with Walt, and he decided to go forward with it anyway. And then also the way the last two scenes right before the end, where we see Saul pull up to JP Wynn. And that is when he goes to JP Wynn in Breaking Bad, when he walks into Walt's classroom, and he's like, "Oh my gosh, you really are a chemistry teacher." And he says, if you want to make more money and keep the money that you make, better call Saul. And so when he pulls up to the high school in this episode and he goes to open the door to the science wing, that transitions to the door opening at the cancer patient's house. And so again, it's just a connection between these bad decisions that he's making. Like, it's a very awful decision to go forward with this. He has been warned not to do it. So I think I'm going to wrap this up here. I had like a bunch of other things I wanted to say. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention. So yeah. And one other thing I forgot to mention is that in that first Mark's house, when Buddy goes in and he's looking at his ID and his credit cards, we learned his name is Alfred Hawthorne Hill. And Hill, another nod to Goodfellas, the main character, Henry Hill. All right, so I'm going to end it here. I definitely didn't get to say everything that I wanted to say. I have like 4 or 5 pages of notes here, but I think that's good enough for now. So if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you're not yet subscribed, what are you waiting for? You made it this far, might as well. And as always, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.